In medieval times, when power belonged only to those born with it, one king's shocking decision at a village auction sent shockwaves through an entire kingdom. Instead of turning 3 innocent peasant girls into servants, or worse, he made them a promise that defied centuries of tradition, a promise that would cost him everything. As nobles plot against him and the church demands his submission, the king's mysterious past begins to surface. A dark secret involving a murdered queen, a lost princess, and a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of power. The 3 girls, thrust into a deadly game they never asked to play, must now find courage they never knew they possessed. Will they survive the night as armed men surround the castle, traitors open the gates from within, and a vengeful bishop demands their surrender? Or will the promise that changed their lives become the very thing that destroys them all? The grand hall of Blackstone Castle was alight with hundreds of candles, their flames dancing upon the stone walls as nobles and merchants gathered for the annual medieval auction. The air hung heavy with the scent of roasted meats, spilled wine, and the subtle musk of wealth, a fragrance that only those who had never known true hunger could ignore. Silk gowns rustled against rough-hewn tables as lords and ladies positioned themselves for the bidding, their jeweled fingers clutching purses of gold. In the center of the hall stood the auctioneer, a portly man whose voice boomed across the chamber with practiced authority. The crowd had already seen the usual parade of treasures, land deeds changing hands, prize stallions being sold to eager knights, and exotic spices from distant lands commanding prices that could feed entire villages for a year. But when the hall doors creaked open to reveal 3 young peasant girls being led in chains, a hush fell over the assembly. The girls, none older than 16 summers, trembled visibly as they were forced to stand upon the auction block. Their tattered dresses, patched and repatched, hung from their thin frames. Their eyes, wide with terror, darted around the room like trapped birds seeking escape. "Next for your consideration," the auctioneer announced, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the hall. 3 virgin peasants from the northern villages, untouched, healthy, and obedient, suitable for household service or other purposes that noble gentlemen might require. A ripple of laughter rolled through the crowd, followed by several shouts of crude suggestions that made the youngest girl burst into silent tears. The bidding began immediately. A fat merchant raised his hand, offering 20 gold pieces for the eldest. A baron countered with 30 for the same girl. Within moments, the air was thick with competing voices, the price climbing higher as nobles eyed the girls like cattle at market. Then, a sudden stillness descended upon the hall as King Edmund himself raised his hand from his throne at the far end. The monarch, known throughout the realm for his cold demeanor and harsh judgments, had never before participated in such auctions. His steel-gray eyes, set in a face lined with 40 years of difficult rule, swept across the assembly. "I will take all 3, he declared, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through velvet. The words hung in the air for a moment before whispers erupted like flames catching dry tinder. "All 3, Your Majesty," the auctioneer stammered, his confident facade cracking for the first time that evening. "You heard me." The king's voice remained level, emotionless. "Name your price." The sum he offered was so extravagant that even the wealthiest lords in attendance gasped. No one dared to counter his bid. The auctioneer, hiding his astonishment beneath a deep bow, declared the sale complete. What happened next would be whispered about in every tavern and household across the kingdom before the next sunrise. Rather than having the girls taken to his private chambers, as everyone had instantly assumed would happen, King Edmund beckoned them to follow him to the royal throne. The crowd watched, confusion replacing their scandalized expressions, as the king positioned the 3 trembling peasants beside his seat of power. "My lords and ladies," the king announced, rising to his feet, "I have not purchased these girls for the purpose you all so readily imagined." His gaze swept across the room with such intensity that several nobles lowered their eyes in shame. "Instead, I stand before you to fulfill 3 promises that will change the course of our history." The middle girl glanced sideways at the king, her brow furrowed in confusion, as if suspecting some elaborate trap. The eldest kept her eyes fixed on the floor, while the youngest continued to wipe away silent tears. To the first, King Edmund continued, placing his hand upon the shoulder of the eldest girl. "I promise lands of her own, fertile fields that will feed her family for generations to come." He moved to the second girl, whose eyes widened in disbelief. "To this one, I will teach the art of governance. She shall learn to rule as a queen would, with wisdom and fairness." Finally, he turned to the youngest, gently lifting her chin with one finger. "And to the third, I grant the rarest gift of all, the freedom to choose her own destiny, unconstrained by birth or circumstance." The silence that followed was profound. Even the bishops present, sitting in their ornate chairs near the throne, could not mask their astonishment. One of them half rose from his seat, his face flushed with indignation, before slowly sitting back down. The three girls exchanged uncertain glances. Were they being saved or manipulated for some greater scheme? The king's reputation for cunning was as well known as his coldness. The eldest dared to raise her eyes, searching the monarch's face for any sign of deception, but found only stern resolve. Throughout the hall, reactions varied wildly. Some nobles appeared disgusted, whispering behind jeweled hands about how the king had lost his mind. Others seemed curious, even impressed by the unexpected display of mercy. A few servants at the edges of the room exchanged hopeful glances, as if witnessing the first cracks in a system that had always crushed people like them. "This auction is concluded," the king declared, his voice echoing against the stone walls. "These three are now under my protection, and any who challenge my decision challenges the crown itself." The pronouncement sent ripples of tension through the assembly. Even before the royal procession had left the hall, courtiers were already huddled in corners, urgently discussing what they had witnessed. By the time the heavy oak doors closed behind the king and the three bewildered peasant girls, the scandal was already racing through the castle and into the town beyond. In their wake, the once orderly gathering dissolved into chaos. Some nobles demanded explanations from the royal advisors who remained, while others hurriedly departed, eager to spread word of the king's shocking behavior. Within hours, every tavern in the kingdom would be buzzing with embellished tales of what had transpired. What none of them saw was the moment when Lord Blackwood, the king's most trusted advisor for 20 years, approached his monarch in a secluded corridor. His face was drawn with concern as he leaned close to Edmund's ear. "Your Majesty," he whispered urgently, his eyes darting to ensure they weren't overheard. "With all respect, this decision could cost you your throne." The king paused, the three girls still following behind him, their chains now removed, but their futures still uncertain. His response was too quiet for anyone else to hear, but the hardening of his expression suggested that whatever game he was playing, he had no intention of backing down. Dawn crept slowly across Blackstone Castle, its golden fingers stretching through narrow windows to illuminate corridors already alive with whispers. Servants moved with unusual haste, their tasks forgotten as they huddled in alcoves, voices lowered but eyes wide with excitement. In the kitchen, scullery maids abandoned their morning bread preparation to share what they had heard from the guards. In the stables, grooms neglected the horses to debate the king's mysterious motives. The castle itself seemed to breathe gossip into every corner. "They say he's lost his mind," a chambermaid whispered to her companion as they hastily made beds in the guest wing. "Giving land to a peasant girl? Teaching another to rule? It's madness." "Perhaps it's some cruel jest," her companion replied, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "The king has never shown mercy before. Why start now with three nobody girls?" Similar conversations echoed throughout the stone fortress as morning light strengthened. Beyond the castle walls, the news had already reached the town, spreading from tavern to market square, like wildfire in summer drought. By midday, not a soul in the kingdom remained ignorant of King Edmund's shocking proclamations. Meanwhile, in the secluded eastern wing of the castle, the three young women awakened to luxuries they had never imagined. Soft linen sheets replaced the straw pallets they had known all their lives. Clean water for washing, heated even, stood in copper basins beside their beds. Simple but well-made dresses had been laid out for them, replacing their tattered rags. Marta, the eldest at 16, ran her calloused fingers over the fabric of her new dress in disbelief. She had been destined for a farmer's bed before her village's tax collector had seized her for unpaid debts. Now the king spoke of giving her land. It seemed impossible, a cruel dream from which she would surely awaken. Agnes, the middle girl with serious eyes and a thoughtful demeanor, stood by her window, watching servants cross the courtyard below. Since childhood, she had been told that a woman's role was to serve, to bear children, to remain silent in the presence of men. Yet the king had proclaimed she would learn to govern. The thought both terrified and thrilled her. Young Eliza, barely 13, sat cross-legged on her bed, chewing her lower lip nervously. Freedom to choose her own path was a concept so foreign she could scarcely comprehend it. What did one do with freedom? Where would she go? Who would tell her what she ought to become? Their quiet contemplations were interrupted by a sharp knock. A stern-faced woman entered, introducing herself as Lady Beatrice, the king's housekeeper. "You are expected in the chancellor's study within the hour," she announced, her tone making it clear she disapproved of their presence. "The king has commanded that your education begin immediately." She spoke the word education as though it tasted foul on her tongue. By mid-morning, all three girls had been escorted to different parts of the castle. Marta was taken to meet with the royal surveyor to discuss the boundaries of her promised land. Eliza was guided to the royal gardens, where she would spend her day learning about the plants and herbs that grew there. Her first small taste of exploring options for her future. It was Agnes, however, who faced the most daunting challenge. The royal chancellor's study was a cavernous room lined with scrolls and leather-bound volumes. Maps covered one wall entirely, and a massive oak table dominated the center, around which 7 elderly men in fine robes were seated. These were the king's most trusted advisors, men who had spent decades whispering in the royal ear. Chancellor Rothwell, a hawk-faced man with 60 winters behind him, did not rise when Agnes entered, nor did he offer her a seat. Instead, he looked her up and down with unconcealed contempt. "So," he began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "this is the peasant girl our king believes can learn the art of governance." The other advisors chuckled, exchanging knowing glances. "Tell me, girl, do you know your letters? Can you even write your own name?" Agnes stood perfectly still, her hands clasped before her. She had, in fact, been taught basic reading by the village priest, a rare privilege for a peasant girl, but fear locked the words in her throat. "As I suspected," Rothwell continued, not waiting for her response. "Well, His Majesty's wishes, however misguided, must be obeyed. We shall attempt to pound some rudimentary knowledge into that simple head." What followed was 3 hours of deliberate humiliation. The Chancellor brought forth complex documents about grain tariffs and asked Agnes to interpret them. When she struggled, the advisors laughed. He demanded she recite the names of noble houses and their alliances, information she had never been exposed to. With each failure, Rothwell's smile grew more satisfied. "Perhaps we should begin with something simpler," one advisor suggested with mock kindness. "Something suited to a woman's understanding. The management of a kitchen, perhaps." Agnes had remained silent throughout the ordeal, her cheeks burning with shame but her spine straight. Now, however, something shifted in her expression. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. "3 months ago," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I heard King Edmund speak in our village square. He said that justice does not look at the clothing of the accused, but at the truth of their actions. He said that dignity is the birthright of every person in his kingdom, regardless of their station." Her eyes moved from one astonished face to another. "I may not know your noble houses or your tax systems, but I know what justice feels like when it is absent. I know what dignity means to those who have been denied it." The chamber fell silent. Chancellor Rothwell's mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish pulled from water. The king's exact words, spoken months ago and seemingly forgotten by all but this peasant girl, hung in the air between them. "Perhaps," said a previously silent advisor at the far end of the table, "we should begin her education with the king's own principles of governance." Throughout the castle, similar scenes were unfolding. In the surveyor's office, noblemen gathered to whisper about how to prevent Marta from claiming her promised lands. Maps were discreetly marked, boundaries subtly shifted. One suggested that the land in question should be declared unsafe due to flooding risks. Another proposed that ancient hunting rights could be invoked to maintain noble access to the property. In the royal gardens, servants watched Eliza with both curiosity and suspicion. A kitchen boy, delivering herbs to the cook, paused to ask her what she would do with her freedom. The question lingered with her as she examined a patch of medicinal herbs. What would she do? What could she do? Was the promise real, or would it vanish like morning mist? As evening approached, the three girls reconvened in a small chamber where they had been told to take their evening meal together. Each looked exhausted, their experiences weighing heavily upon them. "Do you believe him?" Eliza whispered, breaking the silence. "Do you believe the king will keep his word?" Before either could answer, a servant entered with a message. Lord Blackwood, the king's chief advisor, requested their presence immediately. Their meal forgotten, the girls followed the messenger through twisting corridors, aware of the stairs that followed them. Lord Blackwood awaited them in a private chamber, his expression grave. A sealed parchment lay on the table before him, bearing the unmistakable wax impression of the church's highest authority. "A messenger has arrived from the bishop," he told them without preamble. "He demands the king's promises to you be annulled immediately." The three girls exchanged glances, the brief hope they had nurtured beginning to flicker like a candle in strong wind. The great doors of the royal chamber swung open with a resonant creak that silenced all conversation within. Bishop Malachi entered like winter itself, cold, imposing, inevitable. His crimson robes swept across the stone floor, the heavy fabric making a sound like distant thunder as he approached the throne. Behind him followed 6 acolytes in white, their faces solemn beneath their hoods, candles clutched in pale hands despite the daylight streaming through high windows. Not a single courtier dared meet the bishop's gaze. Nobles who had boasted of their courage in battle now studied the floor with sudden fascination. Knights who had faced death without flinching shifted uncomfortably, armor clinking in the tense silence. Even the royal guards tightened their grip on their spears, unsure if their duty to protect the king extended to spiritual threats. King Edmund sat unmoving upon his throne, his face an unreadable mask. To his right stood Lord Blackwood, visibly troubled, but maintaining his dignity. And there, in the shadows behind the throne, almost hidden but deliberately present, stood the 3 peasant girls, witnesses to a confrontation that would shape their fates. Bishop Malachi did not bow. He did not kneel. He made no gesture of respect toward the crown. Instead, he raised his right hand, revealing a parchment bearing the papal seal, its red wax catching the light like a drop of blood. "Edmund of Blackstone," he intoned, deliberately omitting the royal title, "I come before you bearing the word of God's representative on earth." His voice filled the chamber effortlessly, trained by decades of sermons delivered to restless congregations. "Your recent actions have been deemed an affront to divine order and natural law." A collective intake of breath rustled through the assembly. To address the king without his title was provocative. To declare his actions an affront to God was nothing short of dangerous. "The promises you have made to these—" He paused, glancing dismissively toward the 3 girls. "These commoners violate the sacred hierarchy ordained by God himself." He unrolled the parchment with deliberate slowness. "Land belongs to the church and those noble families to whom the church has granted stewardship. The crown belongs to he who is divinely appointed through proper succession. And freedom of choice? Here, his voice took on a particularly scornful tone. Freedom belongs to God alone, not to women of any station, least of all peasants." The bishop's eyes swept across the chamber, meeting the gazes of influential nobles, silently reminding them where their true loyalties should lie. "This document requires you to renounce these heretical promises immediately, or face the consequences of defying the church." The weight of those words pressed down upon the assembly like a physical force. Excommunication remained unspoken but clearly implied, a punishment that would strip the king of his divine right to rule, releasing his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. It was the ultimate weapon of the medieval church, capable of toppling thrones without spilling a single drop of blood. King Edmund remained silent for several long moments, his fingers tapping lightly on the arm of his throne. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured. revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. "The church's concern for my kingdom's affairs is noted, Bishop Malachi." The bishop's eyes narrowed at the deliberate ambiguity of the response. He took another step forward, the papal document held before him like a shield. "This is not a matter for debate or consideration, Your Majesty. The church demands—" A small movement interrupted him. From behind the throne, Eliza, the youngest of the three girls, known for her timidity, had stepped forward. Her simple dress, though cleaner and finer than anything she had worn before, still marked her clearly as common-born. Her hands trembled visibly, but she raised her chin and looked directly at the bishop. "If I may speak, Your Eminence," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, but somehow cutting through the tension like a blade. Shock rippled through the court. A peasant girl, interrupting a bishop? Guards reached instinctively for their weapons, uncertain what protocol demanded in such an unprecedented situation. Several nobles made the sign of the cross, as if witnessing something unholy. Bishop Malachi's face flushed crimson, matching his robes. "You dare to speak in my presence, child? Know your place?" But Eliza took another step forward, her voice gaining strength with each word. "I wished only to ask a question about God's will, Your Eminence." She clasped her hands together to stop their trembling. "If God did not intend for us to have choices, why did He give us hearts that desire? Why can I feel the difference between right and wrong? Why do I dream of better days, if I was meant only to accept whatever fate others decided for me?" The chamber fell utterly silent. The simplicity of her question, delivered without guile or education in theological debate, seemed to hover in the air like mist. Several courtiers exchanged uncertain glances. One elderly noblewoman in the back discreetly wiped a tear from her cheek. Bishop Malachi's face contorted with fury. "Blasphemy!" he thundered, pointing a finger at Eliza as if it were a weapon. "You speak of matters beyond your understanding, girl. This is precisely why commoners, especially women, must be guided by their betters. Your ignorance of divine law proves my point entirely." But something had changed in the atmosphere of the great hall. Servants standing along the walls had begun whispering to one another. A few nodded in agreement with Eliza's words. Even among the nobility, uncertain expressions suggested her simple question had found purchase in minds previously closed. King Edmund rose slowly from his throne, drawing all eyes back to him. He descended 3 steps until he stood on the same level as the bishop, an unprecedented gesture that caused another ripple of shock throughout the court. "Bishop Malachi," he said, his voice suddenly warmer than anyone could remember hearing it in years, "I have always been a faithful son of the church. I have funded cathedrals, donated to monasteries, and followed the teachings of Christ as best a fallible man can." He paused, glancing back at the 3 girls. "But I made these promises in public, before God and my subjects, and I will not break them." The bishop's face darkened further. "Then you choose defiance? You would risk your immortal soul for the sake of 3 peasants? I risk my soul every day, as do we all," the king replied evenly. "But I believe God judges us by the promises we keep, not by the ones we conveniently discard when they become difficult." Bishop Malachi took a step backward, his mouth set in a grim line. "You have been warned, Edmund of Blackstone. The consequences of this defiance will be severe." He raised his voice to address the entire court. "Let it be known that messengers have already been dispatched to Rome. The Holy Father himself will hear of this heresy." The threat hung in the air like the blade of an executioner's axe. Without another word, without the customary blessing, the bishop turned on his heel and strode from the chamber, his acolytes hurrying to follow in his wake. The sound of his footsteps echoed against the stone walls, a rhythmic reminder of the power walking away, and the danger it represented. As the great doors closed behind the churchmen, the assembled court erupted into urgent whispers. Nobles gathered in small clusters, debating what they had witnessed and where their loyalties should now lie. Some cast sympathetic glances toward the king. Others avoided looking at him entirely, already calculating how to position themselves should the crown indeed be threatened. King Edmund returned to his throne, beckoning Lord Blackwood closer. "It seems we face a storm," he murmured, too quietly for others to hear. "Indeed, sire," Blackwood replied, his face grave. The church can turn your nobles against you. Without their support, the king nodded, understanding the unspoken conclusion. Without noble support, his army would fracture. Without an army, his crown was merely an ornament, easily taken. From their position behind the throne, Marta and Agnes had moved to Eliza's side, both amazed and terrified by their companion's courage. The youngest girl was shaking now that the confrontation had passed, tears welling in her eyes. "What have I done?" she whispered to them. "I've made everything worse." Marta squeezed her hand. "You spoke truth to power. Few ever dare." Agnes nodded in agreement, but her eyes remained fixed on the clustering nobles, reading the politics of the situation with newfound clarity. "The bishop will not forgive this," she murmured. "He will return, and when he does, it will not be with words alone." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the great hall, the three girls realized that the promises made to them, land, education, freedom, had become entangled in a power struggle far greater than themselves. They had become symbols in a battle between crown and church, pawns in a game where kingdoms were the prize. Yet somewhere in the crowded hall, a servant whispered to another about the girl who had questioned a bishop. And in the town beyond the castle walls, as evening fell, the story was already spreading. The tale of a peasant girl who had spoken of hearts and choices, and for a moment made even the mighty church seem uncertain. The council chamber erupted into chaos the moment King Edmund closed the door behind him. 20 noblemen, the most powerful in the realm, abandoned all pretense of decorum as they shouted over one another. Fists pounded the ancient oak table, faces flushed crimson with outrage, and more than one hand strayed to sword hilts in barely restrained aggression. "This madness must end," Lord Havelock's voice finally cut through the din. A battle-scarred veteran with vast northern holdings, his opinion carried weight even among equals. 3 peasant girls against the might of Rome, against centuries of tradition. The king risks everything, our lands, our titles, our very way of life. For what? Some misguided sense of charity? Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. The morning sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting pools of colored light across the stone floor, illuminating the growing divide between those loyal to the crown and those sensing opportunity in crisis. "Perhaps," ventured Lord Drayton, a younger noble whose ambition outpaced his wisdom, "we should consider where our true loyalties must lie. The church endures while kings can be replaced." The word replaced hung in the air like a drawn dagger. Even those inclined to agree glanced around nervously, aware that such talk bordered on treason. "The king is still our sovereign," countered Lord Blackwood, his calm voice a stark contrast to the heated emotions surrounding him. As the king's most trusted advisor, he walked a delicate line between representing his monarch and managing the increasingly rebellious nobility. "He has committed no crime. He has simply shown mercy, a quality all too rare in these troubled times." "Mercy?" scoffed Lady Ravenswood, one of only 2 women permitted in the council. Her vast southern estates made her too powerful to exclude, despite tradition. "Call it what you will, Blackwood. I call it weakness, and weakness in a king invites chaos for us all." The debate raged on, growing more fractious by the minute. In one corner, Lord Barrett, a portly man with shrewd eyes, proposed what he called a compromise. "Let the king save face," he suggested, leaning forward conspiratorially. "My son William is unwed. He could marry one of these girls, the pretty one perhaps, and through this marriage we solve the problem neatly. The king's promise is technically kept, the church is appeased, and order is maintained." Several heads nodded thoughtfully, seeing the political advantage in such an arrangement. Lord Blackwood, however, remained impassive. "His Majesty has already rejected similar proposals," he stated flatly. "The promises he made were not about marriage alliances." Lord Barrett's face darkened. "Then perhaps His Majesty should reconsider, before he finds himself with fewer friends than enemies." Outside the chamber, the castle hummed with tension. Guards doubled their patrols, servants scurried through corridors avoiding eye contact, and in the courtyard, knights trained with unusual intensity, as if preparing for conflict. The confrontation with the bishop had transformed what many initially dismissed as a king's odd whim into something far more dangerous. a potential civil war brewing within the kingdom's highest ranks. Meanwhile, in the royal garden, Marta knelt in rich soil, her fingers gently exploring the earth as the royal gardener explained crop rotation. Despite the gravity of the situation unfolding around her, she found herself absorbed in knowledge she had never been permitted before. As a peasant woman, she had worked fields her entire life, but the science behind the growing, this had always been kept from her. The soil speaks to those who listen, the old gardener told her, his hands gnarled like the roots he tended. Most nobles never bother to hear it. They see land as something to own, not something to understand. Marta nodded, thinking of the land the king had promised her. Would she ever actually receive it? And if she did, would she be permitted to keep it? The council's hostility was no secret. Servants whispered of little else. A shadow fell across them, and Marta looked up to see a young serving girl, barely 10 years old, clutching a folded parchment. "For you, mistress," the child said uncertainly, clearly confused about how to address a peasant who now lived among nobility. "From Lady Agnes." Marta broke the simple wax seal and unfolded the note. Agnes had taken to her studies with remarkable dedication, mastering her letters with surprising speed. The message was brief but clear. "Come quickly. Something is wrong with the land documents." Excusing herself from the gardener's lesson, Marta hurried through the castle corridors. She found Agnes in the map room, a circular chamber where the kingdom's territories were meticulously detailed on dozens of scrolls. The middle girl stood before a large table, various maps spread before her, her brow furrowed in concentration. "Look," Agnes said without preamble, pointing to a specific section on the largest map. "This is the land the king promised you. 3 days ago, it extended to this river." Her finger traced a blue line. Now, suddenly, the boundary falls here instead. She indicated a point significantly closer, reducing the promised land by nearly half. "How can a map change?" Marta asked, leaning closer to study the parchment. "It didn't change itself," Agnes replied grimly. "Someone altered it deliberately." A soft cough from the doorway interrupted them. They turned to find Clara, a kitchen maid who had shown them kindness since their arrival. Her eyes darted nervously to ensure no one else was listening. "Begging your pardons," she whispered, "but I overheard Lord Drayton and the royal surveyor yesterday. They were in the small study, arguing over these very maps." She twisted her apron anxiously between her fingers. "Lord Drayton said something about reducing the problem and ensuring proper boundaries are maintained. The surveyor didn't seem happy, but..." She shrugged helplessly. "Who can refuse a lord's command?" Agnes and Marta exchanged troubled glances. The alteration was not merely administrative error, it was deliberate sabotage. "Who else knows about this?" Marta asked. "I believe," Agnes said slowly, her political education already sharpening her instincts. "This goes higher than Lord Drayton. He serves on the King's Council, but he lacks the authority to order such changes alone." Clara nodded. "The servants say half the council meets secretly in the Silver Stag Tavern after dark. They say..." She hesitated, then lowered her voice further. "They say they're planning to force the king to revoke his promises. Or worse. We must tell the king," Marta decided. "Tell the king what, precisely?" A new voice entered the conversation. Lord Blackwood stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Clara immediately dropped into a curtsy and backed away, disappearing down the corridor. "My lord," Agnes began carefully, "we've discovered discrepancies in the land boundaries promised to Marta." Blackwood approached, studying the maps with a practiced eye. After a moment, he sighed heavily. "I see. I feared something like this might occur." He looked from one girl to the other, weighing his words carefully. "The king faces opposition from many quarters. Some will use any means to undermine his promises to you, including theft through map-making," Marta said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "Precisely so." Blackwood's gaze returned to the altered boundary. "The question now is whether to bring this to His Majesty immediately, adding to his burdens, or handle it ourselves," Agnes finished, surprising even herself with her boldness. A hint of approval flickered in Blackwood's eyes. "You learn quickly, Lady Agnes." Meanwhile, Eliza had found herself wandering the lesser-used corridors of the castle. savoring her newfound freedom to explore. Without tasks or chores demanding her attention for the first time in her life, she discovered the luxury of curiosity. Every tapestry, every window view, every winding staircase presented an opportunity for discovery. Servants she encountered regarded her with expressions ranging from resentment to admiration. Her confrontation with the bishop had transformed her in the castle hierarchy. No longer just a peasant girl elevated by royal whim, but someone who had shown courage few possessed. "Is it true?" a young stable boy asked her as she paused to watch him curry a magnificent stallion. "Did you really question the bishop's words to his face?" Eliza blushed. "I only spoke what I felt in my heart." The boy grinned. "My father says the whole town's talking about it. Says even some of the merchants who never cared about peasant troubles are repeating your words." This notion, that her simple question had traveled beyond castle walls, both thrilled and terrified Eliza. What did freedom mean in such a world? The king had granted her choice, but every choice carried consequences she could scarcely imagine. "What would you do?" she asked the boy impulsively. "If you could choose any path, what would it be?" He looked startled by the question, his brush pausing mid-stroke on the horse's flank. "No one's ever asked me that before," he admitted. After a thoughtful moment, he added, "I'd learn to read. They say books contain all the world's secrets." Eliza smiled, about to respond, when the castle bells suddenly rang out, not the regular hourly chimes, but a sharp, urgent pattern that sent guards running toward the main gate. The stable boy's face paled. "That's the warning bell," he whispered. "Someone important approaches, and unexpectedly." By sundown, the three girls reunited in their shared chamber, each bringing troubling news. As they exchanged their discoveries, the altered maps, the secret noble meetings, the warning bells, a sense of impending crisis settled over them like a physical weight. "Everything is connected," Agnes said thoughtfully. "The nobles, the church, the land theft, they're all part of the same resistance to change." A soft knock at their door silenced further discussion. A royal page entered, looking nervous. "His Majesty requests your presence in his private study," the boy announced. Immediately and discreetly, they followed the page through back corridors and servants' passages, avoiding the main halls where nobles might notice their movement. The king's private study was smaller than they expected, a warm, book-lined room where Edmund awaited them, not in royal regalia, but in simple dark clothing. "I believe," he said without preamble as the door closed behind them, "we have discovered a letter. A letter that may explain why I made these promises to you in the first place." Eliza's heart skipped a beat. "What letter, Your Majesty?" "One hidden in my personal chambers," the king replied, his eyes fixing on hers with unexpected intensity. "One I believe you may have already found." The king's private study fell into profound silence. Firelight danced across ancient tomes lining shelves of polished oak, casting long shadows that seemed to breathe with the weight of secrets long kept. Outside, rain had begun to fall, pattering against leaded glass windows like impatient fingers demanding entry. Eliza's face drained of color as she met the king's steady gaze. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides. For a fleeting moment, she considered denying everything. But something in King Edmund's expression wasn't anger, but a complex mixture of pain and relief. "I found a letter," she admitted finally, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "I wasn't searching for it, Your Majesty, I swear it. I was merely exploring the castle as you permitted me to do." She swallowed hard. "In the east wing, behind a tapestry depicting the stag hunt, I discovered a small antechamber. Inside was a writing desk with a false bottom." Agnes and Marta exchanged alarmed glances. Discovering royal secrets, intentionally or not, could be considered treason in any kingdom. Death had been the punishment for lesser offenses. King Edmund merely nodded, his face betraying no emotion. "And you read this letter?" "Yes, sire," Eliza whispered, her eyes downcast. "Forgive me. I know it was wrong, but once I began, I couldn't stop. I felt I was meant to find it." The king rose from his chair and walked to a small, ornate chest positioned near the hearth. From it, he withdrew a folded parchment, yellowed with age and creased from repeated handling. Though he held it reverently, he made no move to open it. "What did you learn from this letter?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Eliza took a deep breath, gathering courage. "I learned that many years ago, Your Majesty had a family that few in the kingdom remember, a queen named Isabella and a daughter called Eleanor." She glanced at her companions, who listened with wide eyes. The letter spoke of their deaths, not from plague as the official records claim, but from betrayal. "Betrayal," the king echoed, the single word hanging in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. "Yes, that is precisely what happened, though few alive know the truth of it." He returned to his chair, the letter still clutched in his hand, and gazed into the fire for a long moment before continuing. 12 years ago, I was not the man you see before you. I was younger, more trusting, perhaps even kind. A bitter smile crossed his face. Isabella was beloved by the common people. She came from distant lands to the east, bringing new ideas that some in the court found threatening. She believed nobility should be measured by deeds, not birth. She established schools where peasant children could learn their letters alongside noble ones. She invited common craftsmen to advise on matters of trade. He paused, his fingers tightening around the parchment. "And she taught our daughter to value truth above station, compassion above power." Eleanor was only 8 years old, but already showed her mother's spirit. The rain intensified outside, sheets of water now streaming down the windows, blurring the world beyond. When they fell ill, I trusted my physicians implicitly. They administered treatments, bled them as was customary, prescribed herbs and tinctures. For 3 days, I watched as both grew weaker rather than stronger. On the 4th day, they died within hours of each other. His voice remained steady, but something in its depths had changed, a coldness that seemed to drop the temperature of the room. It was only months later that I found this letter, hidden among Isabella's possessions. He finally unfolded the parchment, though he did not read from it directly. It was written by my wife in her final hours, when she realized what was happening. The sickness was no natural illness. They were being poisoned, slowly and deliberately, by those who saw their compassion as weakness, their ideas as dangerous to the established order. Marta gasped softly. Agnes reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Isabella named names in this letter," the king continued. "High-ranking nobles, trusted advisors, church officials who feared her foreign ways would undermine their authority. She had discovered their plot too late to save herself or our daughter, but not too late to warn me." His eyes lifted from the parchment, moving from one girl to another. "I kept the truth hidden, allowing the realm to believe the plague had taken them. And while they believed me broken by grief, I began watching, waiting, gathering evidence against those responsible." "Did you find them, sire?" Agnes asked quietly. "The conspirators?" "Some," Edmund acknowledged. "Others died natural deaths before I could bring them to justice. A few remain in positions of power, unaware that I know their guilt." His gaze hardened. "But vengeance alone couldn't heal what was broken in me. Year after year I grew colder, more distant from my subjects. The compassionate king died with his family, leaving only a shell that ruled by fear rather than love." Eliza took a hesitant step forward. "Until the auction," she said. "Until you saw 3 girls being sold like cattle." The king nodded slowly. "I saw in you what had been stolen from me. You, Marta, with your quiet strength, so like Isabella's. You, Agnes, with your quick mind and observant eyes, reminiscent of what Eleanor might have become. And you, Eliza, with your innocent courage to speak truth regardless of consequence." He set the letter carefully on the small table beside him. In that moment, something long dormant stirred within me. I realized I had a chance to honor their memory, not through more death, but through life, through opportunity, through keeping the promises Isabella had made to our people. Promises I had abandoned in my grief and rage. The revelation hung in the air, transforming everything the 3 girls had experienced since arriving at the castle. What had seemed like extraordinary royal whim now revealed itself as something far more personal, more profound, a king's attempt to reclaim his own humanity. But now, Marta ventured. Those same forces that took your family. They rise against your promises to us. Indeed. King Edmund's face grew solemn. History threatens to repeat itself. The same fear of change, the same desperate clinging to power that killed my family now seeks to destroy what I offered you. The church, the nobility, even those who call themselves my friends. Many would rather see me fall than witness the world Isabella envisioned. Is that why the maps of my promised land were altered? Marta asked, her voice strengthening with understanding. Why the Chancellor humiliated Agnes during her lessons? Why everyone watches Eliza with such suspicion? They seek to undermine my promises from every direction, the king confirmed. They believe if you fail or flee, I will abandon this path and return to being the harsh, distant king they could manipulate. The ruler who asked no questions about missing tax revenue, who turned a blind eye to their abuses of power, who let them prey upon the weak. Agnes stepped forward, her face set with newfound determination. But we haven't failed or fled, Your Majesty, nor do we intend to. No, Edmund agreed, something like pride flickering in his eyes. You have shown remarkable resilience, which is precisely why they grow more desperate and more dangerous. A heavy knock at the study door interrupted them. Lord Blackwood entered, his expression grave, water dripping from his cloak. Forgive the intrusion, sire, he said with a quick bow. But riders approach the castle, armed men bearing the bishop's standard, at least 20 strong. They demand entry in the name of the church. The king rose immediately, all vulnerability vanishing from his demeanor. He was once again the monarch, cold and calculating. Have Captain Morris double the guard at the gate. Admit only the bishop himself and 2 attendants, no more. Blackwood nodded and turned to leave, but paused. Sire, there is something else. Lord Drayton is missing from the castle, along with several other council members who opposed your decisions. I fear they may have coordinated with the bishop, Edmund finished grimly. Yes, it would seem our enemies have decided to move from whispers to action. He glanced at the 3 girls, his expression softening momentarily. Return to your chambers and remain there until I send for you. Whatever happens next, remember this. You were not chosen by random chance. Perhaps, in some way I cannot yet understand, you were sent to help heal what was broken, not just in me, but in this kingdom. As they hurried through the darkened corridors of the castle, guided by a trusted servant, Eliza clutched the knowledge they had gained like a precious jewel. The king's story explained so much. His initial coldness, the court's resistance, the whispers that followed them everywhere. We're part of something larger than ourselves, Agnes murmured as they reached their chambers. Something that began long before we arrived, and something many would kill to prevent, Marta added soberly. Eliza moved to the window, watching as torches approached the castle gate far below, their flames guttering in the rain. He trusted us with his greatest secret, she said quietly. We cannot fail him now. But as the 3 girls prepared for whatever confrontation approached with the bishop's men, none of them could shake the weight of the letter's revelation. They had been drawn into a deadly game that had already claimed a queen and princess, and those responsible still walked the castle halls, perhaps watching their every move, waiting for the moment to strike again. Thunder cracked overhead, splitting the night sky as rain lashed against the castle walls with renewed fury. The sudden drumbeat that followed was so perfectly timed with the lightning that many thought it merely another peal of thunder, until its rhythm became unmistakable. War drums, a sound not heard at Blackstone's gates in more than a decade. The castle erupted into controlled chaos. Guards scrambled to their posts, armor clanking in the darkness. Servants rushed to secure windows and doors, while stable boys hurried prized horses to inner courtyards, away from potential fire arrows. In the great hall, knights buckled swords at their waists, their faces grim in the torchlight. From their chamber window, the 3 girls watched as a line of torches snaked toward the main gate, seeming to float disembodied in the darkness. The rain hissed as it struck hot metal, helmets, breastplates, and the tips of spears held high by the approaching force. At least 50 men, Agnes whispered, counting the lights, perhaps more hidden in the darkness. But the king only permitted 3 to enter, Marta replied, her fingers gripping the stone windowsill. What will happen when the rest are denied? Their question was soon answered. A horn blast rose above the storm, followed by a voice amplified by both rage and the castle's natural acoustics. Edmund of Blackstone, by the authority vested in the Holy Church, we demand the surrender of the 3 peasant women you have elevated against God's natural order. Deliver them by dawn, or face excommunication and righteous force. The messenger's words carried clearly even through the rain, designed to be heard not just by the king, but by every soul within the castle walls, nobles, soldiers, and servants alike. It was as much a threat as it was a call to insurrection, inviting those who opposed the king to reveal themselves. Eliza turned from the window, her face pale but determined. "We cannot stay here," she said. "If we hide in our chambers, we become passive prizes to be fought over." "What would you suggest?" Agnes asked. "We cannot leave the castle. The bishop's men would seize us immediately." A sharp knock interrupted their deliberation. All 3 tensed, expecting guards, or perhaps the king's messenger. Instead, when Marta cautiously opened the door, Clara, the kitchen maid, slipped inside, her apron dripping water onto the stone floor. "Begging your pardons," she whispered urgently, "but there's trouble brewing below stairs. The bishop's men aren't just outside, they're already within the walls." "Impossible," Agnes said. "The king permitted only 3 to enter." Clara shook her head. "Not through the main gate." Lord Drayton returned an hour ago through the servants' tunnel beneath the east wall. He brought 6 of the bishop's personal guards with him, disguised as merchants. They're gathering in the old wine cellar, and more castle guards joined them by the minute. The 3 exchanged alarmed glances. If Drayton had turned traitor and was rallying forces from within, the situation was far worse than they had imagined. "We must warn the king," Marta decided. "The king is occupied at the main gate," Clara replied. "Lord Blackwood sent me to find you. He says you must come quickly to the armory. There's no time to lose." With no better option, they followed Clara through servants' passageways and narrow spiral staircases, carefully avoiding the main corridors where Drayton's conspirators might be watching. Twice they ducked into alcoves as groups of guards hurried past, their loyalties uncertain in the growing chaos. The armory was locked and dark when they arrived, but a soft knock in a particular pattern prompted the heavy door to open just enough for them to slip inside. Lord Blackwood awaited them, along with Captain Morris of the Royal Guard and a dozen soldiers wearing the king's personal insignia. "The situation deteriorates by the minute," Blackwood explained without preamble. "The bishop's show of force at the gate is merely a distraction. Lord Drayton has been planning this coup for weeks, gathering support among discontented nobles and guards susceptible to bribery." "How many stand against the king?" Agnes asked, her political education lending weight to her question. "Perhaps a third of the castle guard," Captain Morris answered grimly, "and half the nobles currently in residence. Not enough for victory in normal circumstances, but with the bishop's men outside and more conspirators inside." He left the implications unspoken. "Where is the king now?" Marta demanded. "Holding formal audience with the bishop and his 2 permitted attendants," Blackwood replied. "He knows of Drayton's treachery but must maintain the pretense of diplomatic negotiations to buy us time." "Time for what?" Eliza asked, finding her voice despite her fear. Blackwood's eyes gleamed in the torchlight. "Time to turn the tide. The king may be surrounded by enemies, but he still commands deep loyalty among those who matter most, the common folk who serve these walls, who remember Queen Isabella's kindness, who have suffered under noble oppression." For the first time, the girls noticed other figures moving in the shadows of the armory, not soldiers but servants. Kitchen boys, stable hands, chambermaids, blacksmiths, brewers, and bakers. Dozens of them, armed not with swords but with the tools of their trades, cleavers, pokers, hammers, and makeshift clubs. "The people have watched you 3 closely since your arrival," Blackwood continued. "They've seen Marta's diligence in learning to manage land, Agnes's quick mind in governance, and Eliza's courage before the bishop. You've become symbols of possibility, living proof that birth need not determine destiny." "What would you have us do?" Marta asked, straightening her shoulders with newfound purpose. Captain Morris stepped forward. "The king asks that Agnes take command of the household staff." Organize them to secure food stores, block secondary passages, and gather intelligence on Drayton's movements. Agnes blinked in surprise. Me? Command? You've learned more of castle operations in days than most nobles bother to learn in lifetimes, Blackwood said simply. The servants will follow you. Indeed, the assembled staff were already looking to Agnes with expectation, awaiting direction. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, accepting the unprecedented responsibility. Marta, Morris continued, your knowledge of the land makes you valuable in strengthening our perimeter. Work with the groundskeepers and stable hands to secure the outer buildings and livestock. If this turns into a siege, we'll need those resources. And me? Eliza asked, her voice small but steady. Blackwood's expression softened slightly. You, child, have the most delicate task of all. The king requests your presence in the Great Hall. Your words moved the common folk once before. They may need to hear your voice again before this night is done. As they prepared to disperse to their assignments, a tremendous crash echoed through the castle, followed by shouts and the unmistakable clang of steel against steel. They've begun their move, Captain Morris muttered, drawing his sword. Earlier than expected. Blackwood turned to the three girls, his normally composed features tight with urgency. Whatever happens next, remember this. You were chosen for reasons beyond your understanding. Trust in that purpose, even when all seems lost. The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Agnes moved through the castle like a general, dispatching servants to strategic positions, establishing a chain of messengers to report enemy movements, and securing vital supplies. Those who had once looked down on her as a peasant girl now followed her commands without question, recognizing in her a natural authority that transcended birth. Marta led a determined group of groundskeepers in barricading vulnerable points around the castle's perimeter, using wagons, barrels, and anything else they could find to create obstacles against potential invaders. Her intimate knowledge of working the land translated surprisingly well to defending it. Eliza found herself hurrying toward the Great Hall alongside Lord Blackwood, her heart pounding with each distant clash of weapons. The battle had begun in earnest, spreading through the castle corridor by corridor. What exactly does the king expect me to do? She asked breathlessly as they navigated a narrow passage to avoid the fighting. Give hope, Blackwood replied simply. In dark times, hope is more powerful than any sword. When they finally reached the Great Hall, Eliza gasped at the scene before her. King Edmund stood on the dais, crown gleaming in the torchlight, facing Bishop Malachi across the length of the chamber. Between them, dozens of people, nobles, guards, servants, and townspeople who had sought refuge in the castle, had divided themselves clearly according to their loyalties. On the bishop's side stood Lord Drayton and several other nobles, backed by guards with drawn swords. On the king's side stood fewer nobles but many more common folk, armed with whatever weapons they could find. This needn't end in bloodshed, the bishop was saying, his voice carrying easily in the vaulted chamber. Renounce your heretical promises, return these peasant girls to their proper station, and your crown remains secure. And if I refuse? The king asked calmly. The bishop's smile was cold. Then by dawn, either a new king will sit upon your throne, or this castle will be reduced to ashes around you. The choice is yours. Eliza, still hidden in the shadows at the hall's entrance, felt a chill run through her. The bishop wasn't bluffing. The night would end in either surrender or slaughter. There is another way, King Edmund replied, his gaze sweeping across the divided assembly. One that honors both tradition and progress. One that... He was interrupted by a commotion at the main doors. They burst open to reveal Captain Morris, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "Sire!" he shouted. "Drayton's men have opened the east gate. The bishop's forces enter the castle." Chaos erupted in the Great Hall. The news of betrayal at the east gate shattered the fragile standoff, transforming tense negotiation into immediate crisis. Guards loyal to the king drew their swords, while nobles backing the bishop retreated behind their own armed men. The sound of distant fighting grew louder, steel against steel, shouts of pain and fury, the heavy thud of armored bodies falling on stone floors. Bishop Malachi stood unmoved amidst the pandemonium, his crimson robes a stark contrast to the panic surrounding him. His thin lips curved into a smile that contained no warmth, only the cold satisfaction of inevitable victory. "It seems," he announced, his voice cutting through the clamor like a blade, "that God has rendered his judgment, Edmund." He emphasized the king's name without his title, a deliberate insult now delivered without pretense of respect. "The crown you have defiled with your heretical ideas will pass to more worthy hands before sunrise." Lightning flashed through the high windows, illuminating the hall in stark white light for an instant, casting dramatic shadows across the bishop's features that made him appear almost demonic. The thunder that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of the castle. King Edmund descended from the dais with measured steps, his face betraying no fear despite the crisis unfolding around him. He moved to stand before the bishop, close enough that their conversation became private despite the chaos. "You speak of God's judgment," the king said quietly, "but I see only the actions of ambitious men. Tell me, Malachi, when you kneel in prayer tonight, how will you justify the blood spilled for your pride?" The bishop's expression hardened. "Pride? I act to preserve divine order, the same order you have threatened with your foolish promises to these peasants." He spat the last word as though it tasted foul. "A king who cannot understand his place in God's design has forfeited his right to rule." "And who decides God's design?" Edmund challenged. "You? The nobles who fill your coffers? Or perhaps the same conspirators who poisoned my wife and child when they, too, suggested that birth alone does not determine worth?" For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the bishop's face. "I know nothing of any poisoning," he said, his voice less assured. "No?" The king's eyes bore into him. "Yet you allied yourself with those who did. The same nobles who now stand behind you, who even now seek to preserve their power by force." Before the bishop could respond, the great hall doors burst open again. Agnes rushed in, her hair disheveled, her simple dress smeared with soot. Behind her came 24 castle servants armed with kitchen knives, fire pokers, and makeshift clubs. "The East Wing is secure, Your Majesty," she announced, her voice ringing with unexpected authority. "The kitchen staff and laundry women have barricaded the corridors. 3 of Drayton's men are captured." The king nodded acknowledgement, but the bishop stared at Agnes with undisguised contempt. "This is the madness you have unleashed," he said to Edmund. "Servants taking up arms, women commanding defenses. You undermine the very fabric of society with this perversion of natural order." "Natural order?" The question came not from the king, but from Lord Blackwood, who stepped forward from the shadows where he had been observing. "Was it natural order when Queen Isabella and Princess Eleanor were poisoned to maintain your precious hierarchy? Was that God's design?" A murmur rippled through the hall. Most had never heard this accusation spoken aloud, though rumors had circulated for years about the true cause of the royal deaths. Several nobles shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet the king's gaze. "Baseless slander," the bishop declared, though his face had paled slightly. "A desperate attempt to distract from your imminent defeat. Even now my men secure the castle. By dawn, your men will have discovered the difference between invading a divided castle and facing a unified people." The king interrupted. He raised his voice to address the entire hall. "For too long I ruled through fear rather than justice. I abandoned my wife's vision of a kingdom where worth was measured by character rather than birth. That ends tonight." He turned to face the assembled crowd, nobles and commoners alike. "Those who wish to live in a realm of justice, step forward now. Those who prefer the old ways of privilege and oppression, stand with the bishop. The choice is yours, but make it swiftly, for I assure you, this throne will not change hands without blood." For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then, slowly, a gray-haired knight stepped away from the bishop's faction to stand beside the king. He was followed by a young noblewoman, then 2 more knights, then a handful of servants who had been lingering indecisively near the walls. One by one, then in groups, people shifted their positions, physically declaring their allegiances. Not all moved to the king's side. Several nobles remained firmly with the bishop, their faces set with determination or fear. But when the movement ceased, it was clear that Edmund commanded the majority, not just of commoners, but of fighting men as well. The bishop's confidence visibly faltered as he found himself increasingly isolated. This temporary sentiment changes nothing," he insisted. "My forces still enter your castle. The Pope himself will—" A new commotion at the doors interrupted him. Marta burst in, soaked with rain, a bloody scratch across one cheek. "Your Majesty," she called, "the townspeople have arrived. Hundreds of them bearing arms. They've engaged the bishop's men at the east gate." Indeed, now that attention was drawn to it, a new sound could be heard beneath the storm. Not just the clash of trained soldiers, but the roar of many voices raised together. The battle cry of common folk fighting for something they believed in. The bishop's face contorted with rage and disbelief. Peasants against trained church soldiers. They'll be slaughtered. Perhaps, the king agreed calmly. But they choose to fight nonetheless. That is the power of choice. The very thing you seek to deny them. As if summoned by this exchange, Eliza finally stepped from the shadows where she had been watching. The great hall fell silent as she walked slowly toward the center of the chamber, her simple dress and unbound hair marking her clearly as common-born, despite the days spent in the castle. "Your Eminence," she addressed the bishop directly, her voice remarkably steady despite her youth and the gravity of the moment. "You claim to speak for God, yet you bring violence where there might be peace. You claim to uphold divine order, yet you conspire with those who murdered a queen and princess." The bishop drew himself up, towering over the girl. "You dare to lecture me on divine matters? You, a peasant child who should be grateful for the dirt beneath your feet?" "I speak only what my heart tells me is true," Eliza replied simply. "And my heart tells me that no God worthy of worship values birth above goodness or power above justice." A murmur of agreement rose from many throats. Even some who had remained with the bishop seemed moved by the girl's words, exchanging uncertain glances. The bishop recognized his weakening position. With a gesture to his remaining loyal guards, he began backing toward a side door. "This heresy will not stand," he declared. "Rome itself will answer this defiance. Your crown is forfeit, Edmund, whether tonight or in the days to come." Before anyone could stop him, the bishop and his closest supporters slipped through the door, 4 armed guards covering their retreat. No one moved to pursue them. The confrontation in the great hall had been merely symbolic, while the real battle continued to rage throughout the castle. King Edmund turned to Captain Morris. "Secure that passage. I want the bishop contained, not cornered. A trapped snake strikes with greater venom." As Morris hurried to obey, the king addressed the 3 girls who had now reunited in the center of the hall. "Your actions tonight have inspired more courage than I dared hope. But our position remains precarious. Drayton's forces still control portions of the castle, and the bishop's men continue to enter through the breach." Agnes stepped forward, her natural leadership emerging more strongly with each crisis. "The servants stand ready to defend the inner corridors, Your Majesty. They know every passage, every hiding place." Marta nodded in agreement. "And the townspeople fight fiercely at the gates. I heard them shouting your name, and Queen Isabella's." A shadow of emotion crossed the king's face at the mention of his wife. "Her memory endures, then, despite years of silence." "More than endures," Lord Blackwood confirmed. "It has become legend among the common folk, the queen who saw worth in every person, whose foreign ideas threatened the powerful enough that they took her life." The hall doors burst open once more. This time Lord Drayton himself entered, flanked by a dozen armed men bearing the bishop's insignia. His face was flushed with triumph, despite a bleeding wound on his arm. "Your pathetic resistance ends now, Edmund," he announced. "Surrender the crown, and we may yet show mercy to your supporters." The king did not immediately respond. Instead, he looked to his 3 protégés, Marta, Agnes, and Eliza, as if seeking their counsel in this moment of crisis. It was an unprecedented gesture, silently elevating 3 peasant girls to the status of royal advisors before the entire court. Agnes straightened her shoulders, meeting the king's gaze directly. "Your Majesty has already shown that a promise kept is more powerful than a sword wielded." Marta nodded in agreement. "And that land belongs to those who understand it, not merely those who claim it. While freedom," Eliza added softly, "once granted, cannot easily be reclaimed, neither by bishops nor by lords." Something changed in the king's expression. a hardening of resolve, a clarity of purpose that had been missing for years. He turned to face Drayton, and when he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the great hall. "Lord Drayton," he said with deadly calm, "you stand accused of treason against your rightful king, conspiracy with foreign powers, and complicity in the murder of Queen Isabella and Princess Eleanor. How do you plead?" Drayton's triumphant expression faltered. This is absurd. You cannot—" His protest died in his throat as Bishop Malachi re-entered the hall from a different door, but not as he had left it. The churchman now stumbled forward, his arms restrained by 2 burly castle guards. Behind him came another dozen guards, their swords pointed at the backs of several nobles who had fled with the bishop moments earlier. And in their midst, walking with regal dignity despite her simple dress, was a kitchen maid holding something that gleamed gold in the torchlight, the royal crown, apparently removed from its safekeeping during the confusion. Time seemed to crystallize in the great hall as all eyes fixed upon the kitchen maid and the crown she carried. Her name was Clara, the same servant who had shown kindness to the 3 girls since their arrival, who had warned them of conspiracies, who had moved invisibly through the castle hearing everything while being noticed by almost no one. Now she advanced through the center of the chamber, the royal crown held reverently before her. The golden circlet caught the torchlight, casting fractured reflections across stone walls and stunned faces. Set with rubies and sapphires that glowed like living embers, it represented 1,000 years of unbroken rule, the physical embodiment of power that men would kill to possess. Yet here it was, cradled in the rough, work-worn hands of a kitchen servant. Clara stopped in the precise center of the hall, equidistant from King Edmund and the captive bishop. The silence grew so profound that the storm outside seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. When she finally spoke, her voice, normally soft and deferential, rang with unexpected clarity. "I found His Eminence attempting to flee with this," she announced, her eyes moving from face to face in the assembled crowd. He and Lord Drayton had arranged a boat at the river postern, along with a chest of gold from the royal treasury. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the hall. Bishop Malachi struggled against his captors, his dignified facade crumbling into naked fury. "Lies!" he spat. The word of a kitchen wench against a prince of the church? This farce grows more absurd by the moment. Clara remained unmoved by his rage. "The guards found the boat, Your Majesty," she continued, addressing the king directly, "and the gold, hidden beneath sacks of grain meant to disguise their escape." Lord Drayton's face had drained of color. His eyes darted toward the exits, calculating his chances of escape. But the king's loyal guards had positioned themselves at every doorway. There would be no retreat from this confrontation. "Theft of the crown itself," Lord Blackwood observed coldly. "No longer can you pretend this was about divine order or righteous correction, Bishop Malachi. The truth reveals itself. This was always about power and wealth, clothed in the language of faith to deceive the faithful." The bishop's lips curled in contempt. "You understand nothing of faith or divine right. The crown belongs with those who will uphold God's natural order, not with a king who elevates peasants above their station." Clara's expression remained serene in the face of his vitriol. Instead of responding to the bishop, she turned and walked directly to the center of the hall. There, rather than approaching the king as everyone expected, she stopped before Agnes, Marta, and Eliza. A collective intake of breath swept through the assembly as Clara raised the crown high above her head for all to see. Her next words would be repeated in taverns and homes throughout the kingdom for generations to come. "This crown," she declared, her voice steady and clear, "weighs heavy not just with gold, but with the promises made in its name, and no man or woman in this realm is worthy to wear it if they cannot keep their word." The simplicity and power of her statement struck the gathering like physical force. Knights shifted uncomfortably, nobles exchanged glances, and servants stood straighter, their eyes bright with unexpected hope. For the first time in living memory, someone had dared to suggest that even monarchs must be held accountable to their promises. Clara lowered the crown slightly, her gaze moving between the 3 girls who had become the unexpected fulcrum upon which the kingdom's fate now balanced. These 3 were promised dignity when they had none. Land when they owned nothing, education when they were denied knowledge, freedom when they had only chains, and they have proven themselves worthy of these promises, not through birth or wealth, but through courage, wisdom, and integrity. Eliza, the youngest and most timid of the three, stepped forward. The hall fell silent again as she gently took the crown from Clara's hands. For one breathtaking moment, some wondered if the unthinkable was about to occur, a peasant girl claiming the throne. Bishop Malachi's face contorted in horror at the mere possibility, but Eliza did not place the crown on her head. Instead, she raised it higher, turning slowly so all could see it clearly in the torchlight. "No crown can make a person worthy," she said, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the hall. "And no birth, high or low, can determine the goodness in one's heart. I was born in dirt and raised in hardship, yet the king saw something in me worth nurturing. Not because I deserved it by birth or station, but because every soul deserves the chance to grow beyond the circumstances of their beginning." She turned to face King Edmund directly. "And you, your majesty, born to privilege and power, proved your worth not through your bloodline, but through keeping your promise when every force in the kingdom pressed you to break it." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several knights pounded their fists against their breastplates in approval, while servants nodded vigorously, tears streaming down more than a few faces. Marta stepped forward to stand beside Eliza. "I was to be given land," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "Land that some tried to steal through altered maps and secret agreements." Her gaze fell pointedly on several nobles who shifted uncomfortably under her scrutiny. "But what I received was far more valuable, knowledge of how to manage that land, how to make it fruitful not just for myself but for all who depend upon it. That wisdom is worth more than any deed or title." Agnes joined them, completing the trio at the center of the hall. "And I was promised education and governance," she added, her natural authority evident in her bearing despite her youth. Many laughed at the notion, believing a peasant girl could never comprehend the complexities of rule. Yet in mere days, I learned that true leadership comes not from ancient bloodlines, but from understanding the needs of those you govern, from the highest lord to the lowest servant. As the three stood together, the crown still held high in Eliza's hands. Something shifted in the atmosphere of the great hall. The divisions between noble and common born, between those who had backed the king and those who had supported the bishop, seemed to blur and soften. For perhaps the first time, many present saw not divisions of birth and rank, but simply people, united in their basic desire for justice, dignity, and the fulfillment of promises made. Eliza stepped forward, approaching King Edmund where he stood observing the remarkable scene unfolding before him. Without a word, she knelt and offered the crown up to him, not as a subject to a ruler by divine right, but as one human being honoring the integrity of another. The king hesitated, looking down at the crown with an expression of profound contemplation. Then, to the astonishment of all present, he knelt as well, bringing himself to eye level with the peasant girl. "I have no need of this crown," he said, his voice quiet but carrying in the hushed hall, "if wearing it means betraying what my queen believed. That true nobility comes from character, not birth. That no accident of bloodline makes one person inherently more worthy than another." Rising to his feet, he addressed the entire assembly. "For too many years, I ruled through fear rather than wisdom. I forgot the vision Isabella died for, a kingdom where each person's worth was measured by their deeds, not their parentage. These three girls reminded me of that vision." He turned to face Eliza, who still knelt before him, the crown in her outstretched hands. "Rise," he commanded gently. "No one who speaks truth to power should ever kneel in shame." As she stood, the king finally took the crown from her hands and placed it upon his own head. The act, simple as it was, seemed invested with new meaning, not a claiming of divine right, but an acceptance of profound responsibility. "Let it be known throughout the realm," he declared, his voice stronger now, "that from this day forward, my promises to these three shall be fulfilled in full. Marta shall have her land, with true and accurate boundaries. Agnes shall continue her education and governance, with a permanent place on the royal council. And Eliza shall have her freedom to choose her own path, with royal protection wherever that path may lead. Bishop Malachi, still restrained but unwilling to concede, made one final attempt. The church will never recognize these heretical. The church, King Edmund interrupted calmly, will need to choose a new representative for this region, one who remembers that Christ himself elevated the humble and condemned those who used faith as a cloak for greed and power. He nodded to the guards. Take His Eminence to comfortable but secure quarters. He will be treated with the respect his office deserves, but he will answer for his actions nonetheless. As dawn's first light began to filter through the high windows of the great hall, the storm finally subsiding outside, a strange peace settled over the assembly. Reports arrived confirming that fighting had ceased throughout the castle and town. Drayton's conspirators had surrendered upon learning of his capture. The bishop's forces, leaderless and faced with unexpected resistance from townsfolk who had rallied to their king, had retreated beyond the castle walls. In the days that followed, the kingdom witnessed changes both subtle and profound. Marta received her promised lands, establishing an innovative system of farming that soon doubled yields and improved conditions for tenant farmers. Agnes took her place on the royal council, her sharp mind and unique perspective bringing fresh solutions to old problems. And Eliza, exercising her freedom of choice, established the kingdom's first school open to children of all backgrounds, named, fittingly, Isabella's Legacy. As for King Edmund, once known throughout the realm as cold and distant, he became called by a new name, Father of the People. The solitary monarch who had locked himself away in grief found renewed purpose in continuing his wife's vision. Though he never remarried, he found a different kind of family in the kingdom he had nearly lost, and in 3 young women whose courage had reminded him that the true measure of any person, king or commoner, lies not in their birth, but in the promises they keep. What makes a true king? Is it the crown upon his head, the blood in his veins, or the promises he keeps when everything stands against him? Our story reminds us that true power lies not in titles or birth, but in the courage to stand for what's right, even when standing alone. Like King Edmund, we all face moments when doing what's right conflicts with what's easy. Would you have the strength to honor your promises when every force pushes you to break them? The 3 peasant girls, Marta, Agnes, and Eliza, show us that greatness can emerge from the most humble beginnings. Their journey from auction block to castle defenders proves that dignity isn't granted by others. It's claimed through courage and integrity. Their story challenges us to look beyond appearances, to recognize worth in unexpected places, and to remember that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room belongs to the person everyone else has overlooked. If this story touched your heart, remember that words have power only when shared. Take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs its message today, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that will move you, challenge you, and perhaps even change you. After all, the most important stories aren't just heard, they're lived.